Welcome back to On the Mind. I'm Austin,
I am Duncan.
and today we are going to be talking about Illinois.
We wish we weren't.
We really do, but
We also wish we didn't live here.
well, now we do.
Yeah.
Previously, we were uncomfortable with it, but now we definitely don't want to be here, thanks to a budget that's likely going to pass.
Almost certainly, in fact.
Right. Rauner tried to veto the.
Well, before we get into it, let's give people a little bit of background, because not everyone lives in Illinois.
Not everybody has a massive amount of debt.
True.
Well, in the U.S., federally, yes, we do.
Yeah.
But Illinois in particular.
So Illinois has just entered its third fiscal year without an approved budget. This has led to significant fiscal problems in the state of Illinois. Specifically, we have been going on unpaid bills, unfunded debts for a very long period of time. And actually, we were about to get downgraded to junk bond status, which would have significantly increased the cost of borrowing money for the state, which is something that these days all states do on a very regular basis. It's just sort of part of doing business as a state.
All right, and junk status is below triple B minus?
Correct, yes.
All right, and go ahead and talk a little bit about why it's so important that this gets avoided.
Effectively, we already have a massive debt, and because we've been at a poor bond rating for a relatively long period of time, we're paying a very high interest rate compared to other states that are on sounder fiscal footing to service that debt, or in other words, pay the interest payments on it. If we get downgraded, the cost of borrowing money goes up significantly, and frankly, with the unpaid bills that we have, thanks to this almost 3-year budget impasse, the reality is we would end up paying a very, very high sum to borrow the money that we are almost certainly going to need to borrow at some point to dig ourselves out of this hole. So there was a legitimate fiscal reason behind passing a budget to keep us from going into that particular area. Unfortunately, that budget was a total clusterfuck.
Well, just like everything else in this state, really.
Yeah, pretty much.
So, I mean, we looked at this right before the episode.
Yes.
And
we've done some research into the specifics, and of course we've been following this story. Being Illinois citizens, we've been following this story for as long as it's been developing.
right, so basically what it boiled down to was your favorite politician, Mike Madigan.
Yes, and for those of you who don't live in Illinois, Michael Madigan is effectively the most powerful man in Illinois. He has been the Speaker of the Illinois State House of Representatives for a very long time. He is sort of the de facto head of the Democratic Party. Even when we have a Democratic governor, they're sort of de facto co-heads. Madigan has been a dominant force in Illinois politics for an extremely long period of time, and unfortunately has broad control of the House.
He's actually one of the strongest reasons that a lot of people in Illinois are for term limits.
Yeah.
But beyond that, he got this bill through that didn't have any structural changes to our actual budget. We're still running a massive deficit.
Correct. And let's be very clear. In Illinois, we overspend. We spend quite a bit on social programs. We spend a very large amount of our revenue on servicing the debt, of course, that we've brought up. But also, the pension reforms are a major issue here because Illinois' pension system has been overly generous for a very long period of time with regards to state employees. State employees have been allowed to retire with pension packages that would frankly make people at actual corporations and companies jealous.
Which is kind of insane when you think about it. That's actually added the most debt to Illinois.
Absolutely. And it's also, it is a thorny issue because, I mean, the people who worked in Illinois' government positions have been promised these pension packages. And I can understand it from their point of view where, they want what they were promised. But the reality is that these pension packages should never have been put into effect in the first place because they simply were not properly funded. The revenue was not there at the time, nor at the point that they started coming due to adequately fund them and fund Illinois' operational expenses.
And when you look at it, the last time a tax hike happened in Illinois, it was a temporary one.
Correct.
And during that time period, we didn't pay off much debt when it came to...
We didn't pay off any debt. That period was from 2011 until 2014. During that period, our unpaid bills actually went up from $8.5 billion to $9 billion.
What I'm talking about is our unpaid bill backlog. It declined by $1.3 billion, but the pension debt rose by $25 billion.
Correct. During that period, we also had 5 individual credit downgrades. So if you think that higher taxes are the road to not being downgraded, well, history would seem to prove otherwise. We also went up to having the second highest unemployment in the nation during that period. The cost of servicing our debt rose by 2.5% during that period. Quite frankly, it was an absolute disaster, and at the end of the day, accomplished nothing.
Just looking at this in the long term, it's going to hurt Illinois.
Oh, absolutely.
Not even close. It's insane. And the fact that this got hammered through by Democrats that are just looking to get reelected kind of upsets me.
What's really amazing is that it did draw some Republican votes. Some Republicans crossed over, mostly for the argument of the credit downgrade.
Yeah, the threat of that, no budget is far more likely to be downgraded than a budget, I guess. And the credit agencies, when they put out their report, they showed that they talked favorably about the upcoming budget.
Sure.
Which kind of strange, really.
Of course, the one that they were discussing was not the one that was actually passed, because there was a separate budget that was slightly larger that was discussed, I want to say a day or two prior to the passage of this one, and Madigan and his group in the House actually managed to, basically, Republicans have called this bait and switch, and it's not really too far off on that. They managed to make a series of changes at the last minute that did not really adequately reflect any of the governor's benchmark agendas in terms of spending reform, in terms of pension reform. The reality is our state's in just as bad a shape as it's ever been, and now we're going to have to contend with higher tax rates indefinitely. This is not a temporary increase.
So, unless we get superpowers and somehow manage to get the electorate to stand up for themselves, what's going to happen here?
Well, there are a few ways that this can go. Very unlikely is the possibility that this is going to be overridden somehow. Madigan, if nothing else, can do math. He knows how to get votes, and he knows how to count when he's got the votes. So, realistically, the odds of this not passing are extremely minimal, as are the odds of Rauner being able to get through some kind of amendment to this bill to make the tax increase temporary prior to the 2018 election. Now, most likely, Rauner is going to lose to a Democrat in that electoral cycle. Personally, if you want my call, I think it's going to be J.B. Pritzker, who is currently running on the Democratic ticket for the governor of Illinois. A Democratic governor is likely not going to try to reduce or make those changes temporary. So I think what we're going to see is that this is going to become cemented. The cost of doing business in Illinois is going to go up. The tax burden on the average Illinois citizen is going to go up. And unfortunately, the Democrats are going to be given a lifeline to a source of roughly $5 billion of extra funding a year that they can use to cover reckless spending. I mean, I hate to sound cliched, but this is old school Democrat tax and spend, fiscal irresponsibility in its purest and worst form.
It's kind of insane to me that we were allowed to rack up over $150 billion in debt. How do you even get there without people looking at it and saying, hey, that's probably not a good idea?
Unfortunately, you get there the same way that the United States has arrived at having over $20 trillion in debt.
I will say a lot of that's by getting dragged into wars.
And I'll grant that, but the fact of the matter is that debt is a funny thing. It doesn't appear instantly, and it doesn't have instant problems. People rack up credit card debt because they don't instantly realize that their debt-to-income ratio has skyrocketed. The same thing applies to states and countries, especially with regards to the electorate. And unfortunately, we in Illinois have been willing to sit back and watch this happen for years and years and years and years, and we've been actually willing to let the Democrats, specifically under former Governor Pat Quinn, tell us that tax increases were the way to go, that a tax increase would help us pay down the exorbitant debts that they had racked up. And, history speaks to that. It didn't work.
So let me get this straight. They're not tax and spend Democrats anymore. They're spend and tax.
Yes, they have actually stopped spending the money after they've received it.
Wow. If you thought they couldn't get any more irresponsible fiscally. Well, and you know, it's kind of a hard case to argue to the average individual that lowering taxes will actually help fight debt, because to them that's decreasing revenue.
Right, and in fairness, if we simply lowered taxes and kept the spending the same,
well,
that would be a very foolish.
Reforms.
That would be an incredibly foolish position to take. The problem isn't so much the tax rate in Illinois. In fact, the tax rate in Illinois is one of the very few things that our state has going for us, is a relatively low, flat tax rate. The problem is the spending, not the taxes.
Don't forget our exorbitantly high property tax.
Well, that's true, and that's actually another thing that was not included in this budget. Governor Rauner has been seeking a temporary freeze on property tax increases, basically to lessen the tax burden on both businesses and individuals who own property. And this was not even adequately discussed in this particular budget bill.
So they're kind of doing Madigan did with this bill what the Republicans did with the AHCA bill.
In some ways, very similar.
Sorry to come back to that. It just parallels. Because you see in national discussion, a lot of people like to point at Illinois and say this kind of represents the country as a whole. And it's kind of true, because we have one big city with massive population that overrides the rest of us in the rural areas. And the policies that would work in Chicago do not work here.
Right, and frankly, they don't work all that well in Chicago if you look at the economic conditions in Chicago itself. But they work better in Chicago than they adequately could down here.
Right, and that's because Chicago has such a large base of corporations, work base, it has the infrastructure, it's all local.
Sure.
And when you go down to rural Illinois, they talk about a $15 minimum wage, which under Pritzker would get passed, by the way.
Right. Actually, not to interrupt here
too much. Oh, it's on
his
platform, right?
But I actually spent the other evening looking into it, and every major Democrat who's running for the gubernatorial seat in the election of 2018 has actually either specifically said he would ratify the $15 an hour minimum wage, or in a couple of their cases, voted for it in the state legislature.
Mm-hmm. How many Democrats are running for the governor's seat? I know at least 3.
If you count the small fry, it's, I want to say maybe 8 or 9 people, but most of them aren't really going to count for very much. The primary people to look at are Scott Drury, Daniel Bliss, and J.B. Pritzker. Seem to be the 3 major people who have a reasonable chance.
All right. And you think Pritzker is probably going to run through that primary?
If you extracted a guess out of me at this very early date, and I wouldn't have a great deal of confidence in it, but if you just extracted a guess out of me, I think Pritzker's probably the one with the best chance right now.
Fair enough. All right, so let's just talk about how we got here, you know? And it seems that, to me, we get here by not thinking fiscally, but thinking of morals.
Yeah, and I agree. You
can't legislate morals into law and expect just throwing money at that to work.
Right, and you know, this is one of those things that there's sort of the concept of not bearing fiscal responsibility on the backs of the poor or whatever. And the reality is that when our state gets to something like this, these policies in the end haven't helped the low-income people of Illinois any more than the wealthy people. It's all been a fantastic catastrophe.
Right, and you know, it's just incredible. I couldn't tell you how many people were on welfare before all of this began, but it can't have decreased all that much, if at all.
Right, and again, in many ways, economics is counterintuitive. For example, the concept of increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. On paper, it sounds like a great idea. People make more money, people can afford better amenities, they can afford better and more goods and services, until you realize that what ultimately happens is hours get reduced, people make either a little less or roughly the same than they did before. Nothing changes all that much except that you put a much greater strain on the businesses that are trying to operate and, by definition, employ people.
Well, we just saw a study come from Seattle who did improve $15 minimum wage, and a study found that people are actually taking a little over $100 a month less.
Right, and these studies keep coming out and showing that, unfortunately, economics is complicated. It's not intuitive. And, until the electorate catches up to that fact and starts to understand that you can't just look at something and think of it intuitively, that you have to look much more deeply when it comes to issues, especially with economics, I don't think we're going to have fiscal responsibility either in this state or in the nation as a whole.
I mean, think about it. In primary education or even secondary, how much did we learn about economics?
Very little,
if at all.
I would say that in our high school class, which I think you and I were actually in the same consumer and econ class thing with our former teacher, Mr. King, back in the day.
Yep.
I would say we learned a very few basic principles. Supply and demand. We did learn a little bit about, currency, how it works, etc. But nothing that would be even remotely up to the level of the introductory day of an Economics 101 course.
Exactly, and it's kind of crazy when you think about it. We have people that, and admittedly, a year ago when we started this project, I was one of them. Know very little about economics.
Well, it's never taught.
Exactly.
You have to go out of your way. In fact, you have to go to a lot of trouble to learn it.
Exactly, and in the age of information, ignorance is a choice.
It absolutely is.
So 154 billion going on 155, that was a choice that the electorate made. Whether they want to say that I directly made that or not, that was a choice.
Correct. Or rather, a series of individual poor choices. You never get to somewhere like that where you're in that deep of a hole because of one singular decision. Usually it's a series of bad decisions that were made by a large group of individual people over the course of many years. And that's the case in Illinois. And I think that's also a part of why we don't see a whole lot of kickback on it. Because if one single decision was made by one single person that put our state $155 billion in debt over a fairly closed system period of time, I think it's reasonable to say that people would look at that and say, okay, that decision was demonstrably bad. Let's never make that choice again. Unfortunately, when it's, say, 100,000 individual small budgetary decisions, it's much harder to say, okay, these were the broader policies that led to that series of decisions being made. Let's not pursue those policies.
And it comes back to this again. It's just they see the debt increasing, but then they say, hey, I see the program that did that, and it's doing good things.
Sure.
And they, again, vote with their heart instead of their mind.
Right.
Well,
and
not even their mind. It's just they don't think about the consequences to come.
And one thing I think that everyone should consider when they look at that is, yes, is it perhaps doing some good? Is it perhaps yielding some benefits? Oftentimes, the answer is yes. And the correct response is still to vote against it. And it can be a very counterintuitive and a very difficult thing to do, but the reality is, in the long term, if that program is not sustainable fiscally, it's going to fail eventually, and we're going to end up in these situations. And unfortunately, I have to go back to that old adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mm-hmm. I fully believe that everyone, with the exception of Mike Madigan, who I consider a slimy scumbag, probably had good intentions when they voted the budgets for these programs. But good intentions does not equal fiscal policy that is good.
Fair enough, and it just comes back to this. I think people are just kind of fed up. Our generation has seen a lot of poor fiscal choices in our lifetime.
Absolutely.
We grew up in the 90s when Clinton actually rolled back some regulations on Wall Street. And then now we have so many people saying those regulations led to the recession. Argue all you want among that was actually fraud. We're a little jaded when it comes to that, our generation, I think. And that's why I think so many of us voted for Bernie.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I'm going to go back to the path to hell being paved with good intentions on that one. I think he didn't necessarily have good fiscal policy, but at least it was something. I understand why people went to that, because it was something different. it was at least something that had not been roundly tried and roundly failed over and over and over again.
Fair enough. So, let's talk about the path from here. Let's talk best case scenario, and I think that starts with structural spending changes.
Absolutely. Across the board. And, it doesn't need to be people are very apt to consider, what is this going to do with me? And, I'm going to give you an example. There has been talk of Illinois' public universities losing their accreditation because of lack of funding. As a result, people who otherwise would take, let's say, only a nominal interest in this particular matter, who are students at those colleges or parents of students at those colleges, have suddenly become very engaged over this particular issue. And they say, well, this program that I benefit from needs to be funded. And, that's the nature of human response in a lot of ways. But what we have to look at is that we don't just have to cut one program or the other, or, this third one over here. We need to be looking at major spending cuts across the board that distribute as evenly as possible the pain that we're going to have to go through in order to pay this off. I also think that a temporary tax increase is a good idea at this point. Unfortunately, love it or hate it, and believe me, I hate it. We need to generate some tax revenue, service this debt, pay down the debt, specifically the most recent debt. And that may seem, again, kind of counterintuitive, but the most recent debt is the debt that we've borrowed at the highest interest rates. And if we pay that down, the cost of servicing our debt will actually decrease much more rapidly than paying off older debt would allow for.
That's kind of strange to think about, isn't it? You think, well, pay off whatever's the high. Well, I guess that's basic economics and family spending.
I was going to say, it's like they say with credit cards. You take the credit card that you have the highest interest rate on, and you pay that one down first, because that's the one that's going to cost you the most money over time. And bonds work in that regard much the same way.
So I know that some bonds, I'm pretty sure at least that you buy them, and then after a period of time, the government pays them back with interest, basically.
Yeah, that's the basic idea behind a bond.
Are you allowed to pay off a bond early?
What you can do is you can pay back the debt with the interest on an earlier basis. It's kind of a bond. It's what's called a bond buyback, effectively, where you're actually buying back some of the debt. It has certain advantages. Usually it's used in the corporate bond world, where private bonds are issued to raise money for individual initiatives. But it's something, if nothing else, it's something the state really should explore, whether we have that option, especially considering that these bonds are relatively high risk for the investors and the institutions that are currently holding them.
Right, and I kind of wonder what would happen if we did default on our debt and go into junk status. What would happen if a state failed?
Well, that is a really interesting question, because that just hasn't happened before. We don't know exactly where that would go, what the exact mechanisms would be. Presumably federal funding, the federal funding that already exists, would continue to flow in. But ultimately, it would still be up to us, I think, to dig ourselves out of that hole. Because there is no mechanism for the federal government acting as a guarantor of those bonds.
Fair enough. So, anything else you want to talk about, Duncan?
Basically just the fact that we need to look at where we are, where we've been, what's happened when we've tried these policies before, the tax increases with the alleged attempt to pay down the bills. And I think what we need to do is we need to look very carefully both at our representatives and ourselves and say, is this the best set of decisions that could have been made under these circumstances? And if the answer is yes, then continue to vote for the people that are incumbents that you voted for in the past. If the answer is no, which I would contend very heavily that it is, I would say that it's time to look at new representation, to look at people who are more fiscally responsible, to look at people who are actually willing to tackle hard problems rather than increasing the taxes on all the rest of us to cover those problems up, which is ultimately what this is about. So I think we need to have a very strong look at our representation in Illinois and, ask ourselves the hard questions.
I honestly believe that's true as well. I would like to honestly see this go beyond party lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's actually why we got to the where we are at today. And I think Illinois is actually the single biggest, in my mind, contributor to this thought that we need more than just Democrats and Republicans. They're also, it's the biggest example of why we need fewer hardline Democrats that are further left in our federal Congress.
Right, and I mean, Mike Madigan's an interesting breed. He's kind of an outdated figure. He's less of a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren than he is more of a Chicago political machine circa 1920s holdout. He's kind of an antiquated figure, which makes him interesting in some ways. But, no, he has been directing how Illinois acts for far too long. His policies have failed time and time and time and time again. And I'll point out that the last time that we raised taxes and the last time that the tax increase failed to even put a dent in our debt, the exact same man was the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Illinois, and it was Michael Madigan.
Mm-hmm. So, I think Duncan's request is we vote him out, but I'm sure he's in a safe district.
He's in a district that votes overwhelmingly for him, yes.
So another thing we need to tackle is gerrymandering, but we'll talk about that in another episode.
I agree.
That's far too big a topic. Any closing statements? I
pretty much made mine.
All right, well, that's all that's on the mind. If you have anything to add, please leave it down in the comments section below. If you like the video, please like it.
If you live in Illinois, please let us know. We can commiserate with you, and if we live close to you, we will come and drink this through with you.
Right. We'll
all drink it over.
We'll help the alcohol industry. How about that?
We're already done. I mean, we each have 3 beers in front of us, and we're each on our second.
Fair enough.
All right, guys. Have a great night.
And good evening.